Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies along with the occasional commentary piece. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I'd appreciate it if you left this video a like and subscribe to my channel to see future content like that. Thank you for all the great reception on my last video, giving me a lot of motivation to continue doing these quick review series that I've been doing. They seem to be doing pretty well, so I'm going to keep pushing forward with them for now. And today's is going to be another episode of quick album reviews, since the last episode was a quick movie review section. And today I have 8 albums to talk about, and they're all pretty interesting in their own way, shape, or form. So let's not waste any more time and let's go ahead and get into the first album that I will be discussing. Okay, so let's get started with an album that released fairly recently, and that is Demi Lovato's newest album. Now, with this album, I was very interested in it because all these signs were pointing to, especially with the release of the first 2 singles, that Demi was going to be going back to their roots. And that is essentially what happens here. Demi has been known for doing pop punk in the past, although you could say with their previous work that it was very Disney Channel pop-esque. It was very safe because they were a part of that label. This new one is definitely a different brand. In fact, I wouldn't call this one pop punk as much as I would punk rock in many places. And in many places, it leans even more into the intense edge of those genres, way more than I was expecting it to. And I say that as a positive. This is perhaps Demi's best album for me. Overall, I had a lot of fun with this album, and I wasn't necessarily expecting Demi, out of all people, to release one of the better made punk rock albums this year, but they really outshine their peers on this album over and over again, honestly. If there's anything that's bringing them down, it is the sometimes rough production where the grit could shine a little more in certain songs, but there are still a lot of great things to enjoy here. First of all, it's clear that Demi is having a lot of fun with their vocal performance. They are just going off the charts here, and there's some really impressive vocal gravitas here. This is just a really fun album, and you can tell that Demi is just letting themselves loose and just letting themselves have a great time. You can see that from the very beginning with the track Freak, which has a very circus sort of vibe to it, like a Welcome to the Freak Show thing, which is very intentional because this album is very wild, and it does feel very theatrical in many places. My favorite on this album probably comes in Eat Me, to be honest, which is not one that I was necessarily expecting to be my favorite, because I've never been the biggest fan of what I've heard from Royal and the Serpent, but maybe I could give that artist another chance as well, because what they contribute to this song is really impressive. Demi gives them a proper feature as well, which is a nice change in a world where sometimes features just don't get the proper light to shine, especially with pop-centric artists. But Royal and the Serpent gets a whole verse to themselves, as well as a whole chorus, and it makes for a really great song. Come Together is also a really good song, and I think it is one of the few on here where it uses its double entendre pretty well, and it doesn't feel super cheesy, whereas that can be a problem on other songs. That problem does come through in the title track, for an example, but I still can't help but really have a lot of fun with the title track, even if it is a little cheesy in what it's going for. It still feels very confident, and the chorus just soars. It has almost a classic rock vibe to it. Now, there are some issues with this album. Like I said earlier, the production is a little rough around the edges in certain places. It feels like Demi's voice is sometimes clipping in some places when the mix can't control how loud her voice is getting, and I feel like more could have been done with that. And there are a couple of songs where I wish there had been a little bit more bite to them. Like Skin of My Teeth has a lot of weight to it as a sort of redemption for Demi of being sober again, of letting go of the past demons that they have had, but it just doesn't have enough power in it to sell it for me as well as it could. And there are also some songs to me that are just straight up weak. I feel like Heaven is just one that I don't really care for. I think it's very cliched to use like a relationship and be like, this relationship is my religion or whatever. But still, this album was a big surprise for me. I am glad that Demi Lovato returned to their roots, and if anything, amped up the intensity and amped up the fun, all the while giving some very valuable messages and giving a definitive statement for themselves as an artist. I think this is hopefully a new direction for them, one that they can stick on because they are so good at it. And even with the flaws in this album, I found it very enjoyable. Strong 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. Next, let's talk about Muse's newest album, Will of the People. I'll be honest, I was a little concerned for this album going into it because of how totally different from each other the two singles were and how messy they were. Now, Won't Stand Down was a song that I started out liking, and there are still some aspects of it I like the very intense guitar work, but the guitar work, the intensity of it that almost verges on the metalcore in some places, is sort of contradicted by these Imagine Dragons-esque electronics that are done in the verses, which are just so obnoxious and so out of place. And then Compliance was a bit of a bigger eye roll to me. I didn't really care for the synths here. They felt very cheesy and overdone, and the song honestly felt like, even though Muse claims it's not, I sort of call BS. It feels like it was meant for an anti-mask rant during the COVID pandemic. I think in context of the rest of the album, you could argue that maybe it's not, but there's just some lyrics here that clearly seem to be leaning that way to me, and it just sort of rolled my eyes because it is just so overdramatic, if that is what it is saying, and I honestly sort of think it is. But how does the rest of the album fare is the question. Well, unfortunately, I did originally start feeling sort of more generous to this album, but the more I listened to it, the more it went down on me, and it went down on me pretty hard, pretty fast. And I will say one of the biggest culprits of this is the title track itself. The title track is so irritating. It is repetitive, it says its name over and over again, and it sort of copies The Beautiful People in terms of its format, and The Beautiful People is honestly a song I've never liked either. I know that's probably a controversial take for some, but this song copying that formula really did nothing for me. And the song is overproduced to sheer obnoxiousness. Also, just the lyrics are some of the most eye-roll-worthy thing. Let's push the emperors into the ocean. Don't need a goon to flood with devotion. With every number our hour increases, we'll smash your institutions to pieces. It's so utterly vague that it just really becomes meaningless. This album, Muse said it's supposed to play like a greatest hits album, but it's also supposed to be conceptual, but because it's playing out like a greatest hits album, it doesn't feel conceptual at all, as it shifts haphazardly from one genre to the next, to where the album feels very incomprehensible in many ways. There's some songs here also that just do nothing to stand out for me. I think of Liberation for an example, which just feels like cheap queen worship and is definitely another one of the weaker songs here. Ghosts fares a little bit better and is a song I generally like, as it is a dedication to those who passed during the COVID pandemic. You Make Me Feel Like It's Halloween is a bit of a yikes to me, as it's talking about an abusive relationship, it seems to me, and doing it with this upbeat, fun 80s groove that I just don't think really works with the vibe of the song. And it, once again, it just feels over the top and theatrical for no real reason, and it's just super silly, and I don't really like Matt Bellamy's falsetto on this song, if I'm gonna be honest. The second half of the album overall does get a little better. It has a good 3-track run that I think is actually pretty solid. Kill or Be Killed is the most intense song on the album by far, and I think it's the most consistent. It has the most interesting musical structure, even if the lyrics are still a little basic. Verona is probably the best song on the album for me of this forbidden Romeo and Juliet-like love, and Euphoria does feel positively euphoric in terms of its guitar work, and I think the chorus is legitimately beautiful. But things end off on a terrible note with We Are Fucking Fucked. This song just sucks hard, and I hate that it's just basically doom-scrolling the song. It tells about how the state of the world that we're in, and yeah, there's a lot of bad things about our world, but I don't like the thought that we just throw our hands up in the air and say, oh well, there's nothing to be done. I feel like that's just a horrible statement to leave the album out on, and all this inspiration about rising up against the government ultimately rings hollow by the last track. I know in some way, shape, or form that this track isn't really meant to be taken seriously, but the fact that it just ends the album off on such a sour note and with some terrible, terrible production on Matt's vocals, it just leaves me with the worst taste than it probably would have if maybe the album had ended with Euphoria. Overall, this album sadly rings as a disappointment for me, and especially after returning to Muse's albums, their early albums, for the first time in a while, I think that made my opinions on this album shrink down even more to where my initial rating of it, a 3 out of 5, was way too generous. I still can't put this quite at a bad 2 out of 5 because there is some instrumental choices in here I do like in some places, like on Kill or Be Killed or Verona or Euphoria. There are some places where it works, but overall this album just isn't great, and I feel like a pretty big step down again for Muse, and I just wish they would go back to their old sound, but I feel like we're long past that, and they sadly sort of feel like a parody of themselves at this point. 2.5 out of 5 stars for me, and even then, I might be being generous. Next, let's talk about Beyonce's newest album, Renaissance. I honestly don't have a lot to say about this one, and I'll be honest, I'm not the most familiar with Beyonce as an artist. I know she's pretty big and she has a very dedicated fan base, and I'll be honest that I haven't really listened to many of her albums that much. I actually liked this album pretty well. I thought it was a pretty fun album, and it showed how to do house music right, unlike Drake's album from earlier this year. Now, there isn't really anything about this album that I would say is particularly mind-blowing, whether in the lyrics or in the just the way the music is presented. I'd say lyrically, probably the best song on here is America Has a Problem, and that is because that song has a really, I think, relevant message to it, and you can tell Beyonce cares what she is saying there. But then you contradict that with a song that is more lyrically weak, like Break My Soul. While I do like Break My Soul, actually, I do think it's a fun hit song, and it might be one of my favorite hit songs of the year so far. I do still think it's a bit weird that Beyonce is cosplaying as a blue-collar worker in some of the verses. Overall, this album is solid enough. I think it is fun enough, and while it doesn't do anything particularly special for the house genre, I think Beyonce is talented as a vocalist, and I think it's clear that she's enjoying herself on this album. 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. Oh boy. Okay, next we're talking about Panic at the Disco's newest, Viva Las Vengeance. Wow, Panic at the Disco has fallen off quite a bit recently, haven't they? It's really disappointing that what is essentially a Brendon Urie solo project in everything but name has become so vain and so self-important, but it seems like Brendon can't escape that part of himself. I don't dislike Brendon Urie, not by any means, but I do think his ego gets the best of him more often than it doesn't on his albums. But this new album, I'm gonna be honest, I think it is their worst. I think it is Brendon Urie's worst effort by far. It is just, it's bottom of the barrel pretty bad, and I'm actually probably gonna be more generous to this than some people have. I know some people are rating this as low as a 1, and talking about it pretty harshly. I'm not going to quite go that far, but I am still going to say that this album is pretty bad in many places. There are some places where you can see shreds of potential. I think the title track is legitimately a pretty great song. I think it actually does its theatrical vibe pretty well, and the off-kilter chorus that originally struck me as not really fitting well with the song, but the more I listened to it, the more it actually worked for me. I also think Don't Let the Light Go Out is a pretty good song. It sort of has this Frank Sinatra vibe in the way Brendon Urie is singing, and I've always liked when he's used his lower vocal register, as he actually seems pretty comfortable there. And I think the ending song, Do It to Death, isn't terrible by any means. It is overproduced to high heaven, but I do like how sort of crazy it is and how it just goes for it with the bombast. But that is the one time I will give a compliment for when a song goes over the top. Because there are many places where this album goes over the top, and it just doesn't work at all. And then there's times when the songs just play it utterly safe and become just ugly sounding as a result. I feel like Middle of a Breakup, which was the second single for the album, and this one definitely gave me a bad vibe because It's trying to be a Grease ripoff, essentially. I mean, you can tell that from the music video itself. It's trying to be like that, and it is so cheap. It just feels like a jukebox musical piece that was sort of meant to be thrown away, but somehow still made it on the album. There are many places where he's trying to use his higher vocal register, and I don't know if he's just lost the ability to hit those notes or if he's trying to do too much with it, but it sounds like he is straining many times when he's trying to hit those high notes, and it comes across as a painful listening experience in some ways. If it wasn't for the sometimes really good instrumentation in the background, this album might be unbearable to listen to in some places. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely some places where this album is in fact unbearable to listen to. Star Spangled Banner is, I think, Panic at the Disco's second worst song after Hey Look Ma, I Made It, because man, I hate this song so much. It's saying like they're the new Dead Kennedys, which, oh, I mean, that is such a bold statement to make, especially on an album that is decidedly not rock and roll at all in any sense of the word, and is just very cheaply done theatercore pop. God Killed Rock and Roll, coming after that, is quite the bold statement, because this one's pretty bad as well, and it doesn't feel rock and roll in the slightest once again. Sad Clown is an utter mess, a complete and utter mess with some embarrassing moments in it, in my opinion, especially with Brendan's vocal performance. Sugar Soaker is also a pretty bad song, and this one comes pretty close for me to Star Spangled Banner, or Banger rather, as being one of the worst on the album. It just has some of Brendan's worst vocals I've ever heard, and man, how cheap it sounds here. And I talked about how the instrumentation sometimes is okay on this album, and I still say that, but it's the fact that the instruments are produced to sound so cheap and so fake that really hurts it in many places. Something About Maggie is an utterly bizarre placement. I'm not sure what Brendan was trying to do with this song. So overall, yeah, this album is pretty bad. I do not think it's quite as abysmal, bottom of the barrel, as some people are saying, but there are definitely many moments here that ring pretty painful, and the low points on this album are pretty dang low and bring it down quite a bit. Even when I do acknowledge that there were some okay ideas on this album, most of them were not executed well. 2 out of 5 stars for this one. Next is another album where I just don't have much to say about it, and it's Megan Thee Stallion's newest, Traumazine. I think I'll just have to say at this point that Megan Thee Stallion just isn't really an artist for me. I don't really like the type of lyrics that she raps about. It's not like it's anything necessarily out of the ordinary for rap. I think a lot of people criticize her for being too sexual in her lyrics or too vulgar in her lyrics compared to other rappers, but really I don't see a huge difference here, and this album just doesn't really work for me in terms of the writing. It's not like the worst stuff I've heard in terms of rap, and there are some songs on here where I think there is some legitimately pretty good and vicious writing, and there's also some pretty fun songs on here. I really like Red Wine, for an example. I think that's a really good one, and the song featuring Jhené Aiko is actually a pretty good vibe. It just doesn't really stick with me in any way, and it feels like a bit of a mess, like she's trying to do a lot over the course of the album, and while I appreciate the ambition, it just doesn't really work for me as a whole, and it doesn't really do much to keep me wanting to come back to it, if I'm being honest. 2.5 out of 5 stars for this one. Next, let's talk about I Prevail's newest album, True Power. I'll be honest, I wasn't even sure I was going to talk about this album, because I Prevail just totally turned me off with their last album, Trauma. I thought it was very eye-rolling, trendy metalcore. It was trying to do all these things that were marrying pop with metalcore, and it just didn't work in the way I Prevail was setting out to do it. On True Power, it sees I Prevail doing something similar with bringing in pop and rap elements and even trap elements to the album, but this time I think they do it a lot better, because it doesn't feel as trend-chasing like as their last album did. Instead, it feels like a really, and many times, pretty good synthesis of the two sounds, or multiple sounds together. Body Bag was a great introduction to this album, and honestly, I've been pretty obsessed with this song. I really like this one. This one comes close to Bow Down in terms of being one of my favorite I Prevail songs. I really love the viciousness of the lyrics and the way that Eric and the clean vocalist Brian trade off their vocals works very well. I especially love the unexpected breakdown where it starts out pretty intense, but then Brian lets out some raps that work out pretty well in the song's favor. The second single, Bad Things, is Linkin Park to the core. You can tell that is who they were inspired by for the single, and I'm not complaining at all, especially in the chorus where it really soars and becomes one of the catchiest songs on the album. But even outside of those two songs, those two big singles, I think this album works very well. There's Fear and Letting Go sets a very ominous atmosphere and feels very epic, and I like the way it sets the album in motion. Choke has some real nu metal flares to it and is a song with just a lot of fun and is easy to headbang along to. The same could be said for Vicious, which is one of the most intense songs Prevail has done, and I like that they're bringing that intensity repeatedly on this album. Judgment Day is probably the most conventional metalcore-like track on this album, so fans of early Prevail will definitely be happy with this song. And while I was never really any fan of Prevail even when they were doing their regular metalcore stint, I do think this is a good evolution of their brand of metalcore. Now, there are definitely some points where I can still see the genericism of Trauma popping up, or the trend chasing of Trauma popping up. Thankfully, it isn't as much as their previous album. Fake is just very pop-centric, and I don't really care for the chorus much, especially the repetition of Fake over and over, and it's a little annoying in how sing-songy it feels. FWYTYK is a little bit too much trap for me, and I don't really like how it brings the guitars and the trap elements together. It does feel a little messy, if I'm being honest. And Long Live the King is probably the weakest song on the album, because it just doesn't really do much. It has a very cliched, like, pump you up sort of vibe to it, and songs like that really have to do something interesting for me in order for me to like the pump-up vibe of the song, and this one just doesn't. I think this new album by Prevail is a huge, huge step up, and I do think it is their best album for me. I'm really excited to see where they go, and I think I can actually say I'm on board. I've always thought that this band had a lot of potential, and especially some of their bigger songs, and I think they finally did achieve that potential, or at least start to achieve it on this album, and I hope they continue to expand and continue to do interesting things while still keeping their very good metalcore sound intact. 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. Next, let's talk about Pale Wave's newest album, Unwanted. Now, this album is sort of like Demi Lovato's for me, in that it actually does its pop punk and punk rock sound pretty well. But unlike Demi's, I don't think this one has as much bite to it, and it does lean more on the pop punk side than the punk rock side, but I do think it works well for what it is, and it is probably Pale Wave's best album. It feels like the first album where they're sort of coming into their own rather than trying to be imitations of other artists, and I do think there's a lot of pretty catchy songs on here. I think the opener, Lies, sets a pretty fun tone for the album and has some pretty good guitar work. The title track is legitimately solid. The Hard Way has a really good message to it, and I like what it is saying. And Reasons to Live stands as one of the catchiest songs I have heard this year, and it's definitely my favorite on the album. Overall, I think this album is pretty solid. I think it has a lot of fun things to offer, and I think you'll enjoy it if you like pop punk in general. It's a pretty good version of it. 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. And finally, let's talk about TobyMac's newest, Life After Death. TobyMac is one of the last standing in the CCM that I still follow, and for good reason. It's because TobyMac is one of the few in the Christian contemporary music scene that is still trying to do interesting stuff. I think Life After Death is actually a bit of an improvement on the elements. This one is definitely a more pop-centric album for TobyMac, and it doesn't have as many of the intense electronic elements of his last album, but I do think that works better for him. What's even more admirable about this album, and in some places legitimately touching, is that it does feel like a tribute to his son Truett, who passed away tragically a couple years ago. I can't imagine how something like that would feel, losing a child before you as a parent pass away, but I know that must be hard for him. He wrote a really great song for Truett called 21 Years that I think is one of his best late career songs, and that is included on this album and is one of the best songs of the album as well. But the album as a whole feels like a dedication to Truett. I think Help Is On The Way, Maybe Midnight, the opening track, is honestly the best song on the album. This one I was pretty addicted to when I first heard it. I kept on listening to it over and over, and I think it's a great way to open the album as it has some of the introduction of transitioning from darkness into light, talking about the struggles that Toby has gone through, while also transitioning into more hopeful vibes in the chorus, especially where it becomes really upbeat and has this almost gospel feeling to it that I really enjoy. Deeper is also a really good song. I think it gives a good thesis statement for TobyMac's faith and how he wants to continue to grow in it and continue to understand his relationship with God more. I think it's one of the better written Christian songs I've heard in recent memory because of its sincerity and just its inherent goodness. And I think Torn Wells is a great feature on here. Promised Land sees TobyMac collaborating with a just pretty legendary vocalist in Sheryl Crow. I wasn't really expecting this collaboration, but it works pretty well. And it's another song where we see TobyMac getting a little bit darker and a little bit more into deeper sides of him that we don't always get to see from this artist. The same goes for Everything About You, and I love that this song sees him collaborating with his daughter for the first time, who has a beautiful voice, by the way. And the song actually made me tear up a little because it does feel like family members mourning for the loss of someone that they cared for deeply. But even in the midst of some of the more sadder or darker sided songs here, there are a lot of upbeat moments that I think work. The goodness is poppy to the extreme, but is a lot of fun. I think Cornerstone works pretty great, especially in collaborating with Zach Williams, though I do feel he was criminally underutilized here. And I think that Show Up Choose Love is also a pretty fun song in what it does. And we can't go without talking about Space, where TobyMac collaborates with his old DC Talks bandmates, Kevin Max and Michael Tate. I love whenever they collaborate together, as they always create great products, even this late into their career. And I really like this song. It's not as rocky as DC Talk was, but honestly that would feel out of place on this album anyway, so I like that they go for a more fittingly spacious atmosphere. It works very well for all three vocalists. I do think when TobyMac raps on this album, his rapping doesn't work quite as well, and this is especially true on Life on It, which I also do feel is a little melodramatic in the way he's talking about being persecuted for faith, and the fact that he's talking about it in context of America, I don't know, it just doesn't feel very earned to me, in my opinion. But I think what's the weakest about this song is the rapping that he does. I don't think it works very well. I think the featured rapper does bring the song up a little bit, but overall it just doesn't work as well as it could. And Found is also a pretty generic cut, unfortunately. But overall, I did enjoy this album. I think it's another good late career album for TobyMac. I think he's on a pretty good streak here, and I'm wondering how much longer he's going to continue making music. I think he has a pretty good legacy in terms of the CCM world. He hasn't had a whole lot of duds, and even his duds have had some respectability to them in that he's always tried to do something new, and I've always respected that about him, and that continues to be the case on this album. Solid 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. And that ends this episode of Quick Album Reviews. What were your thoughts on any of the albums I talked about? Let me know in the comments below. And once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies on this channel, along with the occasional commentary piece. So, if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please feel free to leave a like on this video and to subscribe to my channel to see future content like that. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.